A very warm welcome to all of you uh, to the third day of the Adam Smith workshop. The conference will run from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Central European time. Uh, During these 4 hours, we'll have 4 paper presentations. Each paper is allotted 1 hour, of which 25 minutes are for the author, 20 minutes for the discussant, 10 minutes for questions from the audience, and 5 minutes to transition to the next paper. In terms of Zoom information, you will automatically be assigned either to the asset pricing room or the corporate finance room, depending on what you selected at the time you registered for the conference. You are free to switch between the rooms at any point during the first 3 hours of the day. And then in the 4th hour, all of us will be in the same room for the joint asset pricing and corporate finance sessions. Okay. We have a very exciting set of papers. I already mentioned yesterday and the day before that we had 550 submissions, out of which we selected 21 papers for presentation. So a selection rate of slightly under 4%. And so I hope that you enjoy the paper presentations that we are about to see now. On the asset pricing side, Tarun Ramodarai will chair the first session. And on the corporate finance side, Vikrant Wig will chair the sessions. I want to thank Vikrant and Johan and Irina and Oog for putting together this fantastic program that we've enjoyed over the 3 days. So with that, Tarun, over to you, and Vikrant, over to you. So we are ready to roll. So a very warm welcome again to all of you, especially if you were not in the asset pricing part of the conference. It's the first time I'm seeing you, so a very warm welcome. I'm delighted to introduce our last speaker for the conference, Pietro Veronesi from the University of Chicago, who will talk to us about self-image bias and lost talent. So Pietro, the floor is all yours. You have 25 minutes.
So title is Self-Image Bias and Lost Talent. It's an unusual paper. This came out of a conversation with my very good friend Marciano, who have been colleagues since, he's a Northwestern, but we know each other since Bocconi. And, what's all about? It's essentially a discussion we were having over dinner. And let me show you a little bit of data. This is a theory paper, but the motivation is what we all know about what's happening in economics, about the gender imbalance or other imbalances. So, just to show you a little bit of data, I don't know if you can see my little hand here, but the top line in the top panel, it's essentially the undergraduates in the top 20 schools that major in economics. And you see a steady rise all the way to almost 40%. It's not gender balance, but it's getting there, or at least it's plateauing here at 20, at least in the last few years. Then the other 2 lines in the top panel are the PhD students. So you see that it's a little bit of 30%, with a good uptick in the last few years, which is a good thing, but it's essentially flat if you want to look at this, but a good uptick at the end. However, what is a little more worrisome, to me at least, is the bottom panel. Here you see the pipeline for top 20 schools. Is the percentage of women faculty in the top 20 school. You see that it's stuck at 20%. Really, it's not moving, in a sense that it looks like we converged. So maybe there is again a little uptick up here. Why assistant professor is kind of important, because that is the intake for an academic career, right? So if it's low at the intake, later you can only lose people, and so it's gonna get smaller. It's as simple as that. You see a little increase in full professor. That's the bottom line down here. Another thing that kind of striking. These are all data that are public. Anybody can look at this, but it depends on how you cut it. This one was surprising to me. I didn't know about that until we actually look at it. So here is the percentage of women assistant professors. Look at the blue bars, and there are 4 groups. So one is all schools in the United States, all without PhD programs. 41% are assistant professor. Then you see all school with a PhD program, and that's already dropped to 30%. And then if you look at top 20 school, it's 22%. If you look at the top 10 school, at 20%. And I didn't give the top 20, top 10. It's something done by the American Economic Association. You see this incredible decline, from 40%, it shows, that's more or less in line with the undergraduates graduating. And then instead, only 20% when you look at the top 10 schools. And instead, then you look at the teaching faculty, which are the other bars here, you see that it's pretty constant. It's 39, 37% or so. And so this generates a bunch of questions in our minds. That's economics, by the way. If you look finance, this is a finance conference, it gets worse across the board. Okay, so the left-hand side is finance, right-hand side is economics. Wherever you look, the numbers are worse. Okay, just these are coming from EDHEC. So what do we want to do in this paper? There is a large literature on discrimination that goes back to Becker with taste-based or implicit bias, like Bertrand Merlenatan type of paper. Maybe you don't want to discriminate, but effectively you do. Or statistical, the statistical, again, it's the idea that, somebody comes with, 2 people come with the same signal of quality, if you want, but that in aggregate, one group is worse than the other. Therefore, you Bayesianly update or use that information as a prior, if you want, into discriminate. But the discrimination literature is all about me selecting somebody based on the group of belonging. Okay, it's because they are, in this case, women, or because they are X, then I discriminate. No, I was an editor. Marciano is an editor. We just look at each other. It says, I don't know. I don't even know how often who is actually writing the paper. And so the question is, can discrimination actually arise without an explicit or implicit distaste for one group? Okay, and or productivity informational differences. So what there are no productivity informational differences. We all have the same information. Everybody has the same productivity, and in fact, we like everybody the same. Okay. However, there could be something else going on that is generating the bias. It's clearly in the data, and the question becomes, maybe we are doing the wrong policies, right? So maybe if we think it was discrimination, we attack discrimination, but then it's not discrimination, it's something else. We are not attacking that. Then, of course, we converge to the wrong place. We are supposed to do something else. And so that's what we do in this paper. Essentially, we have a novel explanation for gender imbalance, or any imbalance if you want. It is based on a completely different take on the issue, which is going to tell you what we have been doing for 30 years is not the right policy. We should do a different policy. So essentially, the model is simple. We have M&F researchers, and it's an overlapping generation. That's going to be the main mechanism. Essentially, all people are going to evaluate young people. And then, but however, each agent, each potential researcher has a type, which is a vector of characteristics. Okay, so each of us is, if you want, is a set of things, right? So that cannot be observed from the research that you do, but we are all different, one way or the other. However, all these research characteristics, as we call them, they are all equally productive. They're all good to generate a paper at the end of the day. Okay, and so the key assumption, though, is that they're going to be very slightly, in fact, calibrated to the data, different distribution of characteristics between the 2 groups. But the overlap is almost 100%. It's just slightly different, and we are going to calibrate that with the information psychology. And in any case, identical ex-ante productivity. So that's important. However, the key innovation here is self-image bias. which is also something very much discussed in the psychology literature, that we as people naturally tend to evaluate others using ourselves as the main point of reference. So if I'm looking at somebody else's work, I tend to use myself as a yardstick to evaluate other people's work. And that's also very well established in the psychology literature. And finally, we are going to start with the idea that initially all people are M, so only one group. The question is whether this thing is going to converge or not. And the results, is actually kind of mind-boggling. It's self-image bias tend to lead to gender imbalance and especially F talent loss. So all the characteristics that tend to be only slightly more common in the F population are just lost. They disappear. And so, you end up in the wrong equilibrium where all these nice characteristics that are there, that I have them too, but they are a little more common in the other group. They just disappear. So you're not gonna in the limit. And however, the average quality of accepted F researchers is actually higher, so when, this is going on average, they have a higher quality, all the F researchers, except that the M researchers that are the ones that are judging this quality are not able to capture. And then imbalance in talent loss is exacerbated when you put career choices of young scholars or the institutional focus to hire based on the expectation of being, publishing or something like that. And then with different seniority level, we get a leaky pipeline, which is something that you see in the data. And then here's the policy. So mentoring can achieve a gender balance, but actually it turns out exacerbate the talent loss of female or F. Why? Because, with mentoring, what you're going to do is to tell anybody to become like me. And so, give up your good qualities and become like the mentor, who is just a group or somebody in a particular group. Instead, it turns out affirmative action does exactly the right thing. Achieve the balance and preserve F talent and reach first best. Okay, so it's almost first best. There's a big literature on that. I'm going to skip it. So let me show you some highlights of the model. It's a discrete time model, infinite horizon. And every period is a unit mass of infinitely lived people coming in, and they are the same size, M or F. So they're all coming. And they are young researchers, and each of them has a particular type. What is a type in our model is a collection of zeros and ones. This is the easy case. We have an appendix, it's completely general on the type of types. But let's say thetas are just zeros and ones. If A is 1, you have a characteristic. If 0, you don't have it. And there are n of them, n is even. And then these are called research characteristics. If you want to have something that you have in mind, we as the editor, we thought, okay, what are the good research characteristics? I don't know, economic motivation, good question, institutional knowledge, ability to find new data sources, solid identification strategy, sophisticated empirical analysis, skillful theoretical modeling, and presentation skill, if you think about hiring, ability to address questions from audience, all those things, right? So it doesn't need to be just, by the way, the moment in which you submit the paper somewhere. It could just be the time when we hire somebody at our institutions. Okay. So, we're going to have two elements in the model. One is what is the probability of producing good research? Okay, objectively good research. Well, we are going to have this idea that the more characteristics you have, the more good characteristics you have, the more ones you have, the higher is the probability. So gamma theta is going to be the probability of generating a paper or a job market paper if you are on the job market. And so the key, sorry, wrong direction. The key parameter here is this guy over here, is rho. Rho is a dispersion ability to produce quality research in the population. Rho is equal to 1, we are all the same, equal to gamma 0. Rho very large means that there are really good people and really not so good people, in producing quality research, so objectively, whether you are able to generate a paper. And, the more ones you have in theta, the higher is going to be the probability. So the more characteristics good, you are good in mathematics, good to do random regression, all sorts of stuff. You are Chris Hennessy, then you're really good, this type of things. Okay, and he's my discussant, that's why. So, but otherwise, you see, there is no G anywhere, so it's no group. Everything is the same for group M or F, and there is equal mass, so it's completely symmetric. And here's the symmetry. So the first n/2 characteristics, the M population has a probability phi to have each of them independently, and F is 1 minus phi. And instead, in the second set of characteristics for n/2 to n, it goes the other way. So F, the F population has a probability F of getting that. However, F is going to be really close to 0.5. So if 0.5, everybody's identical, but phi is just slightly above 0.5. This means that within group, there is a very large within group difference. So we are all different. Essentially, we have a huge difference heterogeneity, but really small across group. Across group, we are almost the same. We're going to use this notion when we calibrate that people use in psychology. Okay. Oops, the wrong way. So here's an example with n only equal 2, just to give you a sense. And then we choose 5 very large just to here to just show you the numbers so that you see what, just to highlight. So if I only have 2 cases, 2 characteristics, you have 4 types, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. And you see that ex ante they're identical. Remember the quality is how many ones you have. So you see that they are symmetric, except that the probability is higher of having 1, 0 in the M population and 0, 1 in the F population. However, the F population also have 1, 0, and the M population also has 0, 1. It's not 0 there. And again, when phi is going to be close to 0.5 here, these are going to be much closer to each other. So what is the dynamics? Again, why each agent has a set of types, and G is right there. It's the group now, M or F. You could be one group or the other. And we're going to have the following notation. A here is an accepted Young research of type theta in group G. Remember that all the thetas are available in both groups, okay? There isn't any sorting there. So the perfect symmetric is just the frequency is a little bit different. And then the other notation that is important is this lambda over here. Lambda is the number of all the researchers. Remember, all the researchers is the mass of all the research of type theta in group G are the ones that are going to decide about the new guys, okay? So the basic dynamics is simple. In each group, in each theta, and for a particular group G, the total mass is however you had mass yesterday, minus people who retired, this AT, we push people out, so that we keep it balanced, plus the newcomers. Okay, and A is completely random. So, A is the total number of newcomers, they are going to be allocated across groups equally, and then you have the newcomers in there. This A is the endogenous part in the model. Well, everything is endogenous, but the idea is that we are going to study this dynamic, okay? So, 2 cases. First, simple one, objective refereeing. We call it refereeing again. It doesn't need to be submitted, objective, hiring if you want. Young researchers enter the model, and if they produce quality research, they get hired. Okay, if you have a paper which does have a T statistic of 4, and it's a good thing, then you get hired. Nobody judges you. It's just the fact that, or let's say that in this case, referees are really just stamping. It's okay, the paper does what it's supposed to be doing, so we hire this person, or promote this person, whatever it is. In this case, you see that ATG, the accepted mass, is going to be equal to the probability to do good research. Gamma is the probability to do good research times the density of that theta, the type inside the population G. Okay, and that's it. That's the dynamics. And in this case, it's simple to characterize, and you get a simple result. Says the limited distribution of researchers does not depend on initial condition, and you end up with a balance. Okay, so you end up 50-50. It's going to happen, probability 1. It's just going to happen. Okay, that's what we would like potentially. However, referees do more than that. They just don't stamp papers. Yes, you wanted to do this, and then you end up the T statistic equal 5, so you're good. You actually check whether is that the good question, is that written well, is that a bunch of other things that are a little more subjective. And so then that's the self-image bias. A young researcher entered the model, but now they get randomly matched with null referees. Okay, so you randomly get matched by somebody to keep the symmetry. And then the idea here of self-image bias that all researchers accept the young researcher if their types are similar. Okay, if you look like me, then here, accept you. If you don't look like me, I don't. And notice that this can be perfectly rational. In fact, in psychology, they call it a rational self-image bias. The idea is, I'm here, I'm an old person, I did research, I managed to get tenure. This means that whatever I did was good for everybody else, okay? Other people before me judge my qualities as being the right ones. So now I receive a paper and I just look at it, I compare it to my papers and say, well, this is very far away from my paper, it's not gonna be good. This is very good, similar to my paper, then it's gonna be very good, okay? Because I'm going to use myself as a yardstick, okay, to judge. So what happens in this case, that the accepted people are going to be, how much you have times gamma, which is the probability of being good, and PG, which is the density. But critically, the evaluation is completely group blind. You only evaluate depending on theta, on the type. And so that's it. And that's the only place where G enters in the density of the population. And this changes everything. So let me just run through the results. I only have a few minutes, 5 minutes. But that's the setting is the important part. But you see, first of all, there are only 3 types that can survive. Either the best possible type, the one with all ones, or the one that has the best in each group, but both of them. And not all of them is either or. And all this depends on the skills distribution across types. Okay, so in the 2x2 model, this would be either this equilibrium 1, 0, 0, 1 or 1, 1. Those are the only 2 equilibria that can survive. And here you remember rho was this parameter that established the dispersion in probability to do good research across types. When this dispersion is important, this means that meritocracy is important. And so only type theta star survives and it converges. So, you can prove that it's all good. What happens though is when this dispersion in the real abilities is not as important, it's below this threshold, forget about the threshold 1 second, then you end up to the other equilibrium, which unfortunately looks like this. Okay, so you literally converge to a steady state, absorbing state, which is different. You don't ever converge to 50-50. Okay, and so that happens when this coefficient rho is sufficiently low, and I'm going to calibrate it in a second. Interestingly, as I said before, in this case, however, the average quality of the accepted F research is actually higher than the one of the M researchers. So they, objectively, they're actually better. They have a more dispersed type of quality that are valuable. The problem is that the M researchers don't value them, and that's the issue. Okay, and M researchers are objectively less quality than the other ones. Here there is an explanation why. And then, moreover, in the limit, the F research group characteristics are underrepresented. So even if they are also available, if you want, in the M population, overall, you have underrepresentation. What does it mean? That the M population just selects as successful the F research that look like them, which means that this bias toward the characteristic of the M population is going to propagate further forever, okay? So there is a source of bias of selecting people like me, because then I give up all the other nice characteristics. I only look at people like me, but now even an F researcher that looks like me will do the same. And the bias will stay forever, okay? And so the dramatic fact is that when the characteristics are many, that's our main proposition, if you want, there exists a large number of for all possible parameter values. If n is large, so you get a judge of many different characteristics, then imbalance always occurs for all possible parameter values. So, there is not even a chance if you wanted to get to the proper 50-50 balance, okay, when n is large. So here is a little calibration if you want. It's it's a distance between 2 groups that people use in psychology. So let me just get to the numbers if you want. So let's say 10 characteristics. We have like 15 or 20. We use 10 just to be conservative. phi is close to 0.5. It is again the difference between people, which give us a D statistic of 0.3, which is what you get, in fact, even smaller than what you get in the data. How do we judge about gamma? Gamma is the probability of doing good research. Well, we assume that the person who is the best, all with ones, has probability one to write a good paper. You know, if you're Lars Hansen, you're going to do it. However, we have another parameter called gamma 0. Well, we match the success rate from PhD programs. It's one way, right? So it turns out, if you look at the data, that the success rate of entering academia from all the PhD programs is 46%. You know, so 50% more of PhD students don't go to academia. These are the data. So we can choose gamma to get there, which give us a rho equal 0.5, which magically actually match this paper over here. Currently on there, they show the different productivity across different people from after the PhD, and it's about 5 times. So the most productive person is 5 times more productive than the least one, who already accessed academia. With that, you end up with this. Okay. Now, this is just the engine. In the paper, we do a bunch of other stuff, which I don't have time to go over, but let me just tell you what we do in the paper. I just wanted to show you the logic of the bias. And then I just tell you in the conclusion. So what do we do in the paper? We have endogenous entry. Okay, if we have that situation, then who is going to actually apply to a PhD as an example? And, you know, we get, you know, the things get even worse. In fact, in that case, here's our main result. Only theta m, so only one type survive. The other one not only is underrepresented, it just disappear altogether. And we show in the paper that just endogenous entry can endogenously generate imbalance. So, you know, this line is with endogenous entry, this one is without endogenous entry. Then we show that, let me skip here. It's always true that you have a female or F with higher quality, the one that get accepted. Then we have the same problem with the hiring institution. You know, why is the bias so big in a research-oriented institution versus teaching institution? Well, because they, you know, the research-oriented institution hire based on publication promise, which goes back to the same bias. If you think that the group is biased, then you don't want to hire too many F researchers because they may not be able to publish if the world is biased that way. And so, you know, you end up exactly with the same issue, only theta m survives in that case. We have a bunch of other results like co-authorship. You may be aware that the JPE paper showing that if you have co-authors, the male researchers tend to be get more of the credit than the F researchers. That is actually implication of our model too. If all referees are biased, you know, are male, then the male characteristics are going to be the important ones when you judge co-author work. And that is going to come out from here. And then we talk about mentoring, which I mentioned. And in this case, as I said, the theta F again disappear completely because any F agent is going to give up their quality, their characteristic, and become an M agent rather. And so you accelerate actually the disappearance of good qualities. And the final thing we do is to look at affirmative action. Affirmative action actually turns out to work, and you end up with a good equilibrium, so with a successful one, because essentially you are imposing to have a diverse type of referee. That's the main, you know, the problem is the referee is wrong, and so if you have a affirmative action, then you know, effectively you have a diverse group of refereeing, which will select the good guys. So eventually it's going to go to the good equilibrium, which is this one. Anyway, so that's the paper. You know, the policy implications are different from what you people do now, which is trying to debias people. Well, you're doing the wrong thing if the biasing is not the issue. Instead, you know, you want to do other affirmative action in more generally broadening the referee group. Okay, so that's the paper. Sorry if I went 1 minute or over.
Thank you, Pietro. That was very interesting. The discussant for the paper is Christopher Hennessy from London Business School. Christopher, all yours.
Okay, so thanks to the organizers for the conference in general, and thanks for assigning me this paper. It was really a fun and interesting paper to read, and I'm not British, so I really do sincerely recommend the paper. It was very interesting, very stimulating. And I'll just scratch the surface. And I think Pietro, in the time allotted, was only able to scratch the surface of what they did in the paper and sort of implications. And the same will be true for me. So hopefully this will just be a jumping off point for the discussion after. So, what I like about the paper is, topics like diversity, they're sensitive, and oftentimes as a consequence, the discussions devolve, even if everybody's well-intended. So, you look back to Becker back in the 50s, he sort of opened up, the discussion on equilibrium discrimination by really kind of subjecting it to a cold hard analysis by just introducing a taste for discrimination. And in the same way, I think this is a context where this is one avenue or approach that might be productive. Certainly not the only one. That is, there are times in which what we can quantify and formalize may miss out on what is essential. I've been reading too much Tolstoy and Wittgenstein lately, so pardon that. So what I like about this paper, I think this paper is a great place to start, right? And I think most good papers don't have the last word on a topic, and it's hardly possible that any paper could have the last word on a topic like this, given the complexity of the problem. But I think it's a good paper in that it's a nice place to start the discussion. What I also like about the paper, any paper that's going to stimulate the literature should be a paper where the barriers to entry are minimal. So what I really like about the paper, in addition to just how interesting it is it's clear that the authors did a nice job despite their technical virtuosity. They lowered the barriers to entry to other folks who kind of want to read their work and build upon it. So really just a very simple, elegant model, limited set of assumptions, delivering really rich implications. And this, I think, is kind of the old school Chicago style, Chicago economic style. So it's a nice read in the sense of not terribly demanding, but giving you a rich set of implications. I mentioned at the bottom bullet point, I had a nice 2-hour, 3-hour discussion with a friend of mine, Felix Vardy, who was one of Marciano's PhD advisees at Princeton. So I'm going to really jump through the baseline model quickly, and really just to highlight, I think, subtleties of interpretation, and kind of in the same way, when I read some of Steve Ross's old papers, his footnotes oftentimes became a research program. A lot of these sort of parametric assumptions can become avenues for future research. So let me comment on a few things. Let's look at the production technology, third bullet point. If I'm a type theta, the probability of me writing a quality paper is this gamma 0 times rho to the average, to the power of the average of my theta. So I kind of think of gamma 0 as maybe my dumb luck parameter. Even if I'm not particularly skilled, I might still get lucky and write a good paper. And it might be an interesting area to think about doing comparative statics on. Again, the paper has such a limited set of parameters that, and each comparative static delivers rich implications. And then we have rho. I sort of interpreted the rho parameter differently than what Pietro did. I sort of thought of it as really the impact of characteristics on quality or probabilities of writing a high paper. So if I look at the difference between the highly skilled person and the dumb luck person, it's all governed by rho, instead of me thinking of it as a dispersion parameter. So I kind of think of it as the role of skill or ability, an influencing thing. And then N, want to revisit that. How should we think about that across various disciplines? And I think, again, each of these parameters, when you try to map it back to the real world, can be interesting basis for discussion. So I suppose things that are noteworthy. Of course, all the characteristics of the vector theta are equally important for quality. That's fine. That's not the important one. Second one I think is more interesting. The quality of a paper depends upon the paper's characteristics in isolation. And I think that's where the discussion gets interesting, because as academics and in the field of academe, I also think what matters is how my paper relates to the universe of other papers out there. So in this paper, or in their model, the quality of my paper can be assessed independently of how it sits relative to other papers. Another sort of comment, last bullet point, is N. So how do I think about that? Is it richness? Is it dispersion? Is it the complexity of the subject? Is it the softness of the science? So for example, George Hardy, the mathematician, said he went into mathematics because it was the area in which he could most decisively prove his superiority over his classmates. So should we think of economics as a large N relative to mathematics? Is N even larger in sociology? I can also think about this kind of in relationship to if I were an athlete. If I were really a great athlete, if I'm Usain Bolt, let's imagine I were great in everything. I'd probably go into sprinting as opposed to gymnastics, because I'd want to take the subjectivity or the complexity of the environment out of it. So I think as we try to map the model's implications into the real world, thinking hard about N and how we interpret N is sort of an interesting thing to discuss. Let me sort of discuss other features, since I suspect I'll run out of time. So what is M and what is F? Is this a model of gender dynamics? And by the way, these aren't mutually exclusive. And or is it a model of other group dynamics? I find the paper equally interesting as a model of other group dynamics, in particular theory versus empirical work. And I suspect the authors might also like that interpretation as well. Production technologies are fixed. So is this sort of a biological? Is it social? And don't we think they might respond to incentives? So I'm going to have most of my discussion will center on, this is a nice starting off point, but I would want to unpack incentives and think about optimizing agents responding to incentives. Now, of course, one cannot do everything in a paper, nor should one. So I would leave the paper as is, just kind of as a jumping off point. I want to think about incentives a bit more. So we've already been through the implications in the baseline. When the reviewers are objective, then regardless of initial conditions, we converge to equal shares. All is well and good. Now we move to this self-image bias world. So I'm not quoting. People will use their personal research styles in making their judgments as to the importance or relevance of a candidate's output. So I accept if your type is the same as mine. And the nice thing about the paper is there's no, gender bias or whatever, no group-based bias at all. It's just self-image bias. So again, what I like about the papers, really everything hinges upon this one assumption. That's the real change. And you get, a rich set of implications, opens up Pandora's box. The world can go really wrong with that self-image bias. So third bullet point, when we look to that self-image bias world relative to the baseline, the accepted mass now has a first term, which is the mass of people of type theta that are already out there. And we converge to kind of a world with kind of the most able, if you will, dominate if characteristics matter enough. Again, I kind of think about mathematics maybe or sprinting, if rho is high, and if the number of characteristics n is not too high. On the other hand, if there's too much noise in some sense, we know what it is parametrically, but in terms of how we think about it heuristically, that's a bit tougher. If there's too much noise, if rho is low, then you end up with a different world where you get these kind of extreme types. extreme M types and extreme F types. As I get to interpretation, I like as well thinking about those extreme types as being a world where these are theorists and empiricists, perhaps, as opposed to male-female, although both implications or interpretations are sensible. So, and again, though, as we get to an extreme number of N, maybe complexity of environments, softness of the discipline, then we can get kind of persistence and really sort of an M-dominated world or an M-dominated discipline. So my main comment is that everything in this paper, it's a good thing, is everything hinges upon homophily. So I think the nice thing about the paper is it really shines a bright light on the negative consequences of those kinds of behaviors. I'll leave it at that for now. And that's enough for one paper. So I wouldn't change the paper at all. But I think it's a good jumping off point for discussion and maybe future work. So let's discuss this issue of homophily. So the authors, understandably, and there's no need for them in this paper to take a stand on the basis for homophily, but I think the basis really doesn't matter. So is it intrinsic to our genetic wiring? I don't think so, right? So certainly in the marriage, dating, mating context, I certainly don't like folks who look exactly like me. Is homophily time invariant? So if we've got these psychology studies, would they be kind of robust over time? And the last question is sort of a rhetorical one. That's going to be my main comment. Isn't homophily dependent on incentives and context, or incentives within a particular academic discipline? So consider economics. Yeah. So my view is homophily is not hardwired. It's an endogenous quantity that's going to depend upon the nature of the payoffs to academics and alternative fields. So, I think the way many folks function, present company accepted, is that so long as their field is above critical mass, scholars have incentives oftentimes to be really tough on their would-be competitors. They're competing for journal space, they're competing for jobs. So I think homophily really depends upon the competitive landscape, the competitive environment. So for example, apocryphally, since structural corporate finance is a infant or dying industry, as it were, discussants might be quite soft on each other. On the other hand, the reduced form discussants at NBR are brutal on each other, right? Because they're competing with each other for jobs, journal space, and there's no danger of their field dying anytime soon. So I think, some people have a strategy, and I guess that's another way of thinking about the paper, which is homophily isn't really thought of in terms of strategic considerations. That is, Pietro kind of spoke about Bayesian updating, and Bayesian updating is what I would do if I were honest, but I think folks in academia, unfortunately, many times are strategic, and so they might have an attitude of, third to last bullet point, let's keep the club size above sufficient size, but keep the club size limited. Apocryphally, people say that of behavioral economics, for those who've tried to enter the field. So I think given how extreme the implications of homophily can be, maybe the next set of papers should think about opening up the black box and endogenizing them. There are going to be some strategic or incentive-based pressures that will push in the other direction that would maybe limit the extent of extremism. So again, but as you can tell, I'm somewhat ambivalent, which is there's also a lot of the implications I like. That is, when I think of the paper as a framework for thinking about M being empiricists and F being theorists, the opposite might have been true 50 years ago in terms of methodologies. We have this prediction in the paper, which is if rho is low, if there's too much noise, and N is high, then you get these kinds of extreme types. And my interpretation of extreme types in the profession we now exist, or we're moving to, is there's a potential for kind of an echo chamber, where highbrow theorists write for highbrow theorists. Empiricists will cite those highbrow theorists, but it's like a Debreu sitting on my table. It's often cited and seldom read. So there's a danger of echo chambers. But even there, I think there are forces that would push against extreme homophily. I think there are forces pushing in that direction, as I said, because I think that implication about extremism, I think is borne out casually by observation, sort of the schism between empiricists and theorists. But again, I think there are forces that would push us against real extremism in the following sense, right? If I look at Tom Sargent, he was a guy who took the time to say, okay, somebody needs to figure out what the heck it is, what Chris Sims is actually saying. That is kind of mapping empirical work into some coherent theoretical framework. So I think cross-fertilization and the payoffs to cross-fertilization will push against extremism. Also, second to last bullet point, oftentimes what I'm impressed by is not people who look like myself, but quite the contrary. Oftentimes I'm impressed by people who do what I cannot do. I don't know whether that's Bayesian or whether it's just irrational self-loathing, but we all know that we're not impressed by people who can solve a Bellman equation if that's what we do for a living. And finally, I think we do care as academics about the novelty of research. When I look at Michael Brennan, Stu Myers, they kind of take on standard problems with a different framework. And sometimes it's annoying to me, but if it does deliver fruit, it really means something. It opens up new avenues. So I think there are forces that would naturally mitigate against kind of extreme outcomes. Just some final thoughts. So I think even those who bristle at diversity discussions, because let's face it, it's fraught with kind of political issues, if you will. I think even if you're just sort of approaching this from a scientific perspective, it matters, right? So if I think about hill climbing, a numerical algorithm, what does it do? Newton-Raphson, it kind of searches locally, but then it scatters things about and looks elsewhere. Otherwise, we just end up at the top of a local max, and we might be far off from a global max. So I really think these discussions are worth thinking about, and they really matter, even if you're not a person who is otherwise inclined to care about those things, let's say. I would say the production function here is a bit problematic in the sense that I would prefer a world with, let's say, 1 0 1 0 1 0 half, and then 0 1 0 1 0 1s, to a world in which we had extreme M and extreme F types. And I guess this is another way of saying, again, I really can't judge a paper or papers in isolation. I kind of need to see how it fits, because there is complementarity. In fact, some people who make stupid mistakes. There's an old quote about Taniyama Shimura, one of the co-authors, made mistakes, but he made mistakes in good directions. If the world were filled with Tom Sargents, maybe Tom Sargent wouldn't have thought about doing what he had done if there hadn't have been folks who made big, conspicuous mistakes. So it's a complicated objective function. But I think future work needs to think about objective function, especially if we're going to think about policy implications. Just a few more remarks. So in one way, I was sort of reacting to people and said, well, don't we just really want disinterested referees, somebody who doesn't have a horse in the race, The problem with that, of course, is that's going to trade off competence. So if we start to unpack incentives, on one hand, we want people who are disinterested. On the other hand, we're going to give up competence. Stigma, that's kind of a small remark. We don't really have an optimizing framework here. Certainly the costs of stigma aren't considered. And finally, I think the issue of evidence, this is kind of like science these days with a trademark and a capital S. I think evidence needs to be field specific, since I think that homophily in academia is not primarily psychological. It is very much a function of incentives. So really a stimulating paper. I wouldn't change the paper at all. The encouraging thing, though, I think for folks who are interested in this research program, there's still a lot to do. For those who like theory, I'm like them. I tend not to like making policy prescriptions, so I'm going to leave that to everybody else in the room to think about policy prescriptions. So thanks to Pietro for writing an interesting paper.
Thank you, Christopher. That was a very thought-provoking discussion. Fantastic. So, Pietro, would you like to respond before we take questions? Maybe a short response.
Thank you. That's it. So it's a sense that I completely agree with everything you just said. So it's, one is to come with a model. A model needs assumptions, and a bunch of things you said are correct. So there is nothing really to discuss. It's I would love to get the slides then, but we can talk offline.
My pleasure. I mean, I'll just say one thing again. So what I like about the framework here is it's a framework where you look at some models and you think if I put one more straw on it, the camel's back is going to break. This framework is really tractable. So I think one can start thinking about alternative assumptions, and you'll still have some tractability there. So it's another thing to like about the paper.
Very good. We can open it up to the floor. If you have any questions, you can either raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask your question. Very good. I don't see any questions. Go ahead.
I'm not a theorist, okay? So I can be completely wrong, but I'm a woman, so that's good. So I have two questions. First of all, if I remember correctly, there is an assumption about group blind lambda, right?
No, there was no assumption. The lambda is the mass of agent of type theta in a particular group. And
but
it's
you assume that
endogenous.
the referee does not observe.
So the referee is gender blind. Can't see anything. It doesn't see whatever. You only see the type, because the type is you can figure it out from the paper if you want, but you don't see whether it's one group or the other.
Yeah, and my question is, this is key because you know that this is not the reality, right? So is this key assumption for your model? And the second question is more policy related. I wonder, since you said that more affirmative action are needed, does this imply that having this sort of gender quotas, I don't want to call this way, but in academia, when people try also to hire more women, would this imply inefficient hiring in your model? Thank you.
Both great questions. On the first one, again, the idea was to find out whether the fact that we see apparent data that suggests that there is some type of discrimination going on, or even different in taste, if you want. People, maybe women don't like economics or finance, which is something I heard here and there. But again, we look at the data, say 40% of undergraduate do economics, so it doesn't look like they don't like it, and 42% they teach economics, which again doesn't look like people, women don't like economics, maybe something else. And so, in order to capture that, we went to the extreme, assuming gender blind completely. Of course, we know that that's not a reality. So, it's in fact, there could be a policy implication. You want to take that into account when you consider those. And that's what the affirmative action does. You don't end up in the inefficiency. You end up in efficiency because even if you mandate it to have the same number, well, I didn't say how we model it. What we model is something simple. You have to hire the same number of M and F every period. That's it, done. And of course, you don't hire people randomly. You always go to the top, but almost instantly, the F group starts selecting the good F, the one that go to efficiency. So you end up with the best possible equilibrium where all the possible characteristics are represented, simply because F will like other Fs, but not because of the group. It's the characteristics that matter. Our model, by the way, I didn't mention, also imply clustering. If you look at the data, there is a lot of clustering in terms of female representation. There is more people, more women in development than in asset pricing. And that is an implication of the model. It's simply the characteristics are showing themselves eventually in the clustering itself. Even if everything is equal, you end up with more representation in one group than in another. And if instead you interpret that as discrimination, this means that people in asset pricing discriminate more than people in development. That sounds pushing it, right? So why, people in asset pricing are more discriminatory than people in development, to me, is really just showing up the characteristics. I mean, that's my opinion. At least that's what the model would imply. Let's put it this way.
I do not agree 100%, but there are nice implications, I think.
Anna.
Thank you. Other questions?
I have a question, a very thought-provoking paper indeed, and a discussion. So I'm speaking as an EDHEC committee member, and we like collecting data and like disentangling theories. So what would be an ideal data, Pietro, to collect that could show that your mechanism is the right one as opposed to other mechanisms that you mentioned in your introductory slides? Thank you.
Yeah, I thought about that a little bit, and we are trying to figure that out. So unfortunately, the prediction of the model averages, to prediction of test-based discrimination. So it's very hard to tell one theory versus another. So one thing that one can look at is measure of distance between papers refereed and the between the paper and the referee, if you want. But a question how you measure distance and then whether there are differences. Another thing that I wanted to see is you need to have information about these characteristics, and we know from the data from people who have done economics and studies of various kinds that there are differences in interest or even a number of psychological traits between women and men. And so, and they are cited in the paper, and they are, very tiny, by the way, but they're there. However, we don't have that type of information for something that is related to finance or economics. In economics, one obvious thing is to think about what are the topics that women think that is important. But let me tell you, compared to men, let me tell you one implication of this, right? So probably development is one of the most important fields now where women, there is a good representation. The point of the paper is to say what the profession believe is important is endogenous and depends on the initial condition. Back 100 years ago, we decided that we're all men. No, we decided we're all men, and they decided that it was important monetary policy, fiscal policy, or all these things about macroeconomics. Development was not represented. If 100 years ago we start with 100% female, maybe now we do much more research on development, which I personally believe is actually much more important than writing a lot of papers on the Phillips curve or for trying to figure out the optimal monetary policy, which we have way too many papers on that. And that's my point, that what the profession decided is important is actually endogenous, depend on the initial conditions.
So on that note, maybe I'll say a few things in closing. Given that I work with Bellman equations and dynamic programming, let me start from the end. 1 year from now, we plan to host an in-person conference at INSEAD on April 21st and April 22nd. So I very much hope that the world is in a condition where we can all meet personally rather than having to meet over Zoom. Taking one step back, in about 2 minutes, we will have the opportunity to meet in breakout rooms to chat with the authors and discussants of the papers that were presented today. So I very much hope to see you at least briefly for a less formal exchange so that we can chit chat and recreate the environment of discussion over coffee or a glass of wine. And the last but not least, I would like to thank the people who've been instrumental in putting this conference together. Mandy Chan and Gabby Schachter from CEPR, and Johan Humbert, Vikrant Wake, Irina Zuizadze, and Oog Langloy, who put together the program for this. So if you can unmute yourself, you can give them a hand of applause. Thank you. Thank you very much.